Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. The night was a dreary one, as though the very air had conspired to stifle the spirit. London, on this November evening, was a city drowned in mist, the fog swirling thick and impenetrable, wrapping the buildings and streets in an eerie veil. The gas lamps, usually so eager to shed their golden glow, now struggled against the oppressive haze, casting but faint shadows along the cobbled streets. It was one of those nights where the very atmosphere seemed to press upon one's chest, the silence broken only by the occasional distant clang of a bell or the muffled footfalls of those braving the murk. I sat by the hearth in our modest sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the fire crackling cheerfully, and yet a certain unease lingered in the air. It was one of those rare occasions when Holmes sat in quiet contemplation, his eyes fixed upon the half-drawn curtains, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the fog. Holmes, with his usual unspoken foreboding, seemed to sense that a case of no small consequence was about to unfold. For as I had learned over the years, such nights were never without purpose when it came to Sherlock Holmes. There was an unsettling stillness about the evening, and my thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sharp knock at the door, an unusual occurrence at this late hour. I rose to answer, wondering what manner of visitor would arrive on such a night. I opened the door to find a figure standing in the shadows of the street, the fog enveloping him like a shroud. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a look of urgent purpose that seemed out of place amidst the quiet desolation of the evening. His features were sharp, and his eyes held the weariness of one accustomed to the weight of power. He stepped forward without a word, a sealed envelope in his hand. "Dr. Watson?" he inquired, his voice low but firm. "Yes," I replied, my curiosity piqued. "May I assist you?" "I am Sir Leontine Harkort, a confidential advisor to the Crown," he said, extending the letter towards me. "I must speak with Mr. Holmes. It is a matter of great urgency." I could see no immediate indication of the gravity of the situation, yet something in his tone stirred the air with a palpable sense of impending importance. Without further delay, I called for Holmes, whose ever-present instinct for trouble seemed to awaken at the mere mention of the Crown. As I handed the letter to Holmes, his sharp eyes flickered over the royal seal, and I could see the subtle shift in his demeanour, a hint of recognition, a fleeting thought that was quickly masked by his usual calm. The mystery had already begun, and I knew at that moment that the night was far from ordinary. Holmes, ever the model of efficiency, wasted no time in reading the letter. As his eyes moved swiftly across the words, I could see his mind already engaged, piecing together fragments of information that would no doubt lead to the resolution of a mystery, one that, judging by the urgency in Harcourt's expression, was bound to be of significant consequence. "Lord Percival Marston," Holmes muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, "a nobleman of no small repute, and one who has had many dealings within the circles of the Crown." Sir Leontine Harkort spoke then, his voice edged with an anxiety that I had not previously noticed. "Indeed, Lord Marston has disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. His absence was first noted this very morning when he failed to attend an important council meeting. We have searched for him throughout London, but all efforts have led to no trace. His family is in an uproar, and the repercussions, should this matter become public, could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. I listened intently as Harcourt outlined the details. Lord Marston, a man known for his quiet influence within the royal court, had vanished without a word. His personal affairs were said to be in order, and yet there were whispers of a letter that, should it fall into the wrong hands, could spark a scandal of unspeakable proportions. "This is no ordinary disappearance, Mr. Holmes," Harcourt continued, his voice betraying the stress of the situation. "There are rumours of scandalous documents, political manoeuvrings, and a conspiracy that reaches into the very heart of the royal court. We must find him before the matter spirals out of control." Holmes, his hands steepled beneath his chin, regarded Harcourt for a long moment. His silence was thick with thought, and then finally he spoke. "We shall begin at once. The case is already afoot, and I have no doubt that we shall find the missing lord, though I suspect the mystery surrounding his disappearance may be far darker than it first appears." The stage was set, and I knew that whatever awaited us would require all of Holmes's unmatched powers of deduction. This, I was certain, was the beginning of a case unlike any we had encountered before. Sir Leontine paused for a moment, glancing towards the window as if the darkness beyond it might overhear. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper, charged with a gravity that made even Holmes lean forward in interest. "There are forces at play, Mr. Holmes," he said, "that do not concern themselves merely with individuals, but with institutions, ancient ones. I speak of blackmail, of treachery, of seditious schemes that aim to undo the very fabric of the monarchy." Holmes regarded him calmly. "Then this disappearance is not an isolated matter?" "No," Harcourt replied. "Lord Marston came into possession of certain documents, private correspondence from a senior royal, misinterpreted, I believe, but nonetheless dangerous, if exposed. There are those who would pay handsomely for them, and others who would destroy to keep them from view." "And these documents," Holmes asked, "do they still exist?" "That," Harcourt admitted, "we cannot say. Lord Marston vanished before any verification could be made. His rooms were searched, but save for a few ashes in the grate, there was nothing." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "So, we have a missing nobleman, unconfirmed but potentially damaging documents, and whispers of royal implication. A dangerous combination." "You understand now," said Harcourt gravely, "why this cannot reach the newspapers, nor the ears of the opposition. If the crown is to remain unblemished, it must be handled with the utmost discretion." Holmes merely nodded, his eyes gleaming with quiet anticipation. "I presume, Sir Leontine," Holmes said at length, "that the matter has been kept from Scotland Yard." "It has," Harcourt confirmed, "at Her Majesty's discretion. This inquiry belongs to no official channel." Holmes stood and moved to the fire. "Then it belongs to us." I could not help but glance at him in surprise. Though I had seen Holmes tackle matters of high import, there was something in his tone that suggested a personal interest, perhaps the intellectual challenge, or perhaps the thrill of discretion at the highest levels. "You shall have all the information I can provide," said Harcourt, rising with visible relief. "I trust your methods, Mr. Holmes, unconventional though they may be." "I shall require access to Lord Marston's personal study," Holmes said, "and discretion from his household staff. We shall leave at first light." With a final bow, Harcourt took his leave, vanishing once more into the clinging fog. As the door closed, Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said, "we are about to walk a knife's edge, sharpened by scandal and shaded by power. A single misstep may slice more than our reputations." And so the game began. The morning following Sir Harkort's visit dawned grey and heavy with mist, as though London itself conspired to keep its secrets close. Holmes and I made our way to Victoria Station and boarded the train bound for Surrey with little fanfare, save for Holmes's customary silence when his mind was fully engaged. The compartment was quiet, but for the soft rattle of the train upon the rails. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes fixed upon some invisible point just beyond the window pane. I knew better than to interrupt such contemplation, though curiosity burned within me. At length he spoke. "Watson, did you observe the curious phrasing in Harcourt's letter?" "I did," I replied, "particularly the phrase, 'preserve the integrity of the house at all costs.' It struck me as unusually dramatic." "Precisely," said Holmes. "When language bends toward melodrama in political hands, it is rarely without reason. This is no mere disappearance, my dear fellow. We are dealing with a vanishing wrapped in threat, perhaps even treason." I was about to inquire further when he raised a finger. "Let us observe first, Watson, and theorize second. Truth often arrives without need of our assistance, provided our eyes are properly open." We were met at the station by a taciturn coachman, who bore no emblem save a faded crest stitched to his collar. 3 white doves, faint against the fabric. Holmes made note of it, though he said nothing as we rode in silence toward Marston Manor. The countryside passed us in muted tones of brown and grey, and soon the landscape gave way to dense hedgerows and ancient oaks that loomed like sentinels along the drive. The manor appeared at last through the mist, its stone facade bearing the weary dignity of an old estate that had known better days. A heavy stillness clung to the place, not merely of silence, but of abandonment, as though something vital had quietly departed with Lord Marston himself. We were greeted by the butler, a solemn fellow by the name of Kittredge, whose manner suggested both loyalty and exhaustion. He led us without ceremony through the main hall, whose portrait stared mournfully from above the wainscoting and into a side corridor leading to the late Lord's study. The manor exuded secrecy, not in the overt sense of guardedness, but in the subtle atmosphere of things left unsaid. Holmes walked with quiet confidence, his eyes already flickering across every surface, noting dust patterns, door hinges, and minute alterations in the carpet's pile. "Notice," he said softly as we approached the study door, "the absence of fresh coal in the scuttle. No fire has been lit here since the morning of his disappearance. That, Watson, is rarely a coincidence." As Kittredge unlocked the door with a heavy key, I braced myself for what lay within. The mystery had led us far from Baker Street, but I knew we were only just crossing the threshold of discovery. The door creaked open upon a room of peculiar disorder. Lord Marston's study was not in the disarray one might associate with violence, nor did it carry the scent of sudden flight. Rather, it bore the subtle chaos of a man interrupted in the midst of delicate matters. Papers lay scattered across the desk in no apparent order. One chair was overturned, and the faint, acrid scent of scorched paper lingered in the air. Holmes moved with feline grace, pausing first at the hearth where a charred remnant of parchment rested half-consumed. He bent low, extracting it with a pair of silver tweezers from his pocket. The edges were singed, but a single line remained legible. "The doves of Saint. Orbins must not." "The doves again," Holmes murmured. "Curious how frequently these birds flock together." I peered over his shoulder. "Do you believe it's a reference to a society?" "Not merely a society, Watson. A movement." He turned next to the desk, where he found a broken quill, the tip stained with red wax. Beside it, an open ink pot and a smear of ink led toward the wastebasket, wherein lay a crumpled envelope bearing a smudged impression, a royal crest, half obscured but unmistakable to those familiar with its design. "There," Holmes said, straightening, "a message begun but never sent, or rather, interrupted. By whom? By someone who wished this correspondence never see the light of day." He moved to the bookshelves, running his hand along the spines. Then he paused, pulled a volume of Byron slightly forward, and revealed a hidden compartment behind it, empty. "Something was here," he said. "Something worth hiding, and evidently worth taking." I felt a chill at the back of my neck. "Holmes," I said, "what do you suppose Lord Marston stumbled upon?" He looked at me, eyes sharp as steel. "Enough, my dear Watson, to make powerful men tremble, and for one of them, perhaps, to vanish without a trace." Holmes stood motionless for some time before the crumpled envelope, his gaze fixed upon the faint wax impression that had only partially survived whatever rough handling it had endured. He retrieved a small lens from his waistcoat pocket and crouched to examine it more closely. "There is artistry here," he muttered, "not in the application, but in the removal." "Removal," I echoed. "Observe," he said, holding it toward me. "The crest bears a partial impression, sufficient for identification, yet the upper quadrant is smudged by what appears to be pressure and friction rather than careless handling. Someone attempted to obscure the insignia, not completely, mind you, only enough to render it deniable." "And you recognize it?" I asked. "Unquestionably. It is a variation of the personal seal used in private palace correspondence, a detail known to only a few within the inner court." The implication struck me instantly. "You believe Lord Marston was corresponding with the Queen?" "Or," Holmes replied, "with someone who wished to make it appear so." He turned back to the hearth. "And this?" "The doves of St. Albans." The phrase reappears. Once in Harkort's letter, once in Marston's burned note. Coincidence, Watson, is a word I seldom employ. There was a pause. "We are dealing with an organisation," Holmes continued, "that is either deeply loyal or dangerously subversive, possibly both." A silence fell over the room. I sensed that the game had shifted, subtly but decisively, and that we had brushed against something vast and unseen, something that bore the faint perfume of royalty and the distant shadow of conspiracy. Holmes requested that the household staff be summoned to the study, and one by one they arrived. Kittredge the butler, Miss Eliza the parlour-maid, and finally a stooped and silent figure I had not yet seen, a groundskeeper by the name of Cray. Kittredge spoke first. "My lord was last seen on the evening before his disappearance. He took supper alone in the study, then instructed I not be disturbed further that night. Come morning, he was gone." "Were the doors locked?" "Yes, sir. I locked them myself, as per routine." Miss Eliza entered next, nervous and fidgeting with her apron. I passed his door around 9:30. Heard nothing, sir. But earlier that evening I did see a gentleman leaving through the side garden gate." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A visitor?" "I believe so, sir. Tall, well-dressed, and in a great hurry." "Did Lord Marston often receive guests at night?" "No, sir. Never." Cray, the groundskeeper, shuffled in, his skin weathered by years of labour. When questioned, he offered a story wholly different from the others. "Didn't see no visitor," he said bluntly. "But I found a fresh horseshoe print by the north hedge that weren't there the day before." Holmes looked intrigued. "You're certain it was recent?" "I've tended those hedges for nigh 20 years. I know when something's new. 3 accounts. One claimed nothing unusual, Another described a hasty visitor. The last noted the telltale sign of a horseman near a hedge unused by carriages. Holmes remained impassive throughout, taking no notes, making no remarks. But as the final servant withdrew, he turned to me and said, almost absently, "3 witnesses, Watson, and each with a separate truth. Somewhere amidst them lies the lie, but which?" It was a question meant for neither of us to answer just yet, not until all the pieces had fallen into place. By mid-afternoon, the local constabulary had arrived, led by one Inspector Tolbert, a ruddy-faced man with the confident air of one already certain of his conclusions. "You'll find, Mr. Holmes," he said with a smile that bordered on smugness, "that the matter is regrettably mundane. Lord Marston, it seems, was in considerable debt, cards and horses mostly, racked up over the last 6 months. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your source?" "A solicitor's ledger recovered from a drawer in the study," Talbot replied, producing a worn document. "The totals are rather damning." Holmes leafed through it. "Indeed, these debts are significant. And yet... Holmes turned a page. "Curious that the entries stopped 3 weeks ago. If Lord Marston had absconded due to pressure from creditors, one might expect a final, desperate expenditure, or at least evidence of arrangements." Talbot shrugged. "Perhaps he paid them off." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured. "But I doubt it." Talbot frowned. "Then what do you propose?" "That the ledger is a distraction," Holmes said simply, "either genuine and irrelevant, or forged to imply motive." The inspector bristled. "With all respect, Mr. Holmes, not every disappearance is laced with intrigue. Sometimes a man simply flees his debts." "And sometimes," Holmes replied coolly, "a disappearance is but a veil draped over a darker purpose." Talbot's colour rose, but Holmes had already turned his back, once more studying the fireplace, the bookshelves, and the solitary window that overlooked the stables. "What do you see?" I asked quietly. "An absence, Watson. There is something that should be here and is not, and that, more than any misplaced coin or altered document, is what troubles me most." He said no more, and for the first time that day, I felt a genuine chill creep along my spine. The mystery was deepening, and Holmes, though outwardly calm, was already moving through its shadowed corridors. The morning found Holmes deep in study, poring over the charred remains of Lord Marston's note with the aid of a small chemical reagent and his ever-faithful magnifying lens. While I busied myself with correspondence, he muttered from time to time, short, clipped phrases, like a man conversing with his own mind. "It is not merely a metaphor," he said at last. "No, this Doves of St. Albans is far more than poetic nomenclature. It is a cipher, one that overlays both geography and ideology." "Do you mean," I ventured, "that it is an actual organization?" "Indeed, a society of reformists," he replied, "operating under the guise of charitable outreach and intellectual exchange. Their meetings are held under strict secrecy, and their membership is selective. A curious mixture of idealists, radicals, and a few who possess far too much access to the Queen's household for my liking." "But how do you know this?" I asked. Holmes produced a pamphlet, seemingly benign in appearance, that he had retrieved from Marston's bookshelf. "Hidden in plain sight, Watson. The document promotes a lecture on agricultural subsidies, but, beneath a careful code of reverse type and symbolic ink marks, it refers to a gathering of the Doves held in St. Albans 2 weeks prior to Marston's disappearance." He sat back. "I now believe Lord Marston was either a sympathiser or a spy." I could not hide my unease. Then if what you say is true, the implications are political, possibly treasonous. Holmes nodded. Precisely why our next steps must be taken with the utmost care. If we stir the wrong shadow, we may awaken a far greater danger than we intended. And as he slipped the encoded pamphlet into his coat, I felt that we had crossed from investigation into something perilously close to espionage. That very afternoon, Holmes insisted upon visiting the British Museum to examine a rare manuscript known to have belonged to a former member of the Doves. While the errand seemed mundane on the surface, I suspected it was yet another of his careful manoeuvres, designed to draw out hidden players. We lingered in the reading room for over an hour, Holmes thumbing through dusty folios with deliberate slowness. I noticed he never truly read, but rather watched the movements of those around us, his eyes darting occasionally to a bearded gentleman in a black overcoat who had followed us from the entrance. When we finally emerged into the street, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows through the thickening fog that had crept in like a living thing. As we walked toward the carriage stand at Russell Square, I became increasingly aware of our footsteps echoing in concert with others behind us. Holmes paused to light a cigarette and leaned close. "We are being followed, Watson. Say nothing. Walk steadily. Turn when I turn." Within minutes, the pursuit intensified. Twice I glanced behind, only to see the same figure and then another. Two men, keeping pace, their collars raised. We reached the corner of Hyde Park, where the fog grew almost impenetrable. Just as Holmes hailed a hansom cab, a second carriage tore from the mist, its horses wild-eyed and foam-flecked. It came straight for us. I barely managed to shove Holmes aside before it clipped the curb and toppled, splintering against the iron rail. Its driver had vanished into the fog. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Deliberate," he said flatly. "Not an accident, a warning, or an attempt to silence us." My heart pounded with the lingering tremor of death narrowly escaped. "But why?" I asked breathlessly. He turned to me with that inscrutable gaze I had come to both admire and fear. "Because, my dear Watson, we are closer to the truth than someone wishes us to be." Our harrowing escape from Hyde Park only deepened Holmes's resolve. That evening, under the cover of darkness, we made our way to a modest townhouse on Charlotte Street, a residence known to belong to Lady Imogen Vale, a woman whose name had surfaced twice in Holmes's inquiries, and once in Marston's partially burned correspondence. She received us with an air of cool civility, her expression unreadable beneath a veil of mourning lace. A widow of some means and once a fixture in society's more avant-garde salons, Lady Vale was known to host intellectual gatherings that blurred the line between progressive discourse and political provocation. "You come regarding Percival," she said, even before Holmes had spoken. Holmes offered a courteous nod. "You were acquainted with Lord Marston?" "Better than most," she replied. "He was a man torn between duty and conviction. I warned him that playing both sides would break him." "Both sides?" I asked. She gave me a sidelong glance. "The Crown and the cause. You believe these are separate entities, but they are not. Not always." Holmes's voice was calm. "And which did you support, Lady Vale?" She hesitated. "I supported truth, but truth is not always welcome in Westminster." There was a moment of silence. "I believe Percival feared exposure," she continued. "He spoke of a paper, the Sovereign Memorandum, a document that, if revealed, could shake the monarchy." "A forgery?" Holmes asked. "A truth denied," she whispered. Holmes thanked her and rose. As we left, I turned to him. "Do you believe her?" "Partially," he replied. "But a woman like Lady Imogen Vale does not mourn lightly. She is afraid." "Of what?" He looked out toward the darkened square. "Of what happens when loyalty becomes a weapon and secrets no longer stay buried. If Lady Imogen Vale had offered us the edges of the truth, then Mr. Augustus Rathbone, the infamous editor of the Metropolitan Gazette, was a man who trafficked in its distortion, a scandalmonger of the highest order. Rathbone had made a name for himself by peeling back the curtains of power and publishing what respectable society preferred remain hidden. Holmes arranged a meeting under the pretense of a legal inquiry, an artifice Rathbone saw through but permitted out of curiosity. "You're wasting your time," Rathbone said, lounging behind his cluttered desk. "I don't deal in treason, only facts and the occasional embellishment. You've printed the name Doves of St. Albans twice in the last month," Holmes replied evenly. "Once buried in a column about reformist circles, the other within a satire on peerage corruption." Rathbone gave a feline smile. "Nothing illegal in speculation, Mr. Holmes." "And what of Lord Marston?" "He was a man of dual appetites," Rathbone said, selecting his words with deliberate ambiguity. "Power and truth. Dangerous combination. When he vanished, I assumed either blackmail or remorse." Holmes tilted his head. "And if it were neither?" Rathbone's expression tightened. "Then he became a liability." "Meaning?" I asked, unable to contain myself. "Meaning," Rathbone said, folding his hands, "that someone with a royal interest found him inconvenient." Holmes rose. "You know more than you admit." "And you," Rathbone replied with a slight nod, "are walking a line that disappears when the ink dries." As we stepped out into the afternoon fog, Holmes said nothing for several paces. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "I believe he believes himself clever. But clever men often forget. They leave fingerprints, even in print." The further we pursued the matter, the more fragmented it seemed to become. Names whispered, allegiances blurred, and motives cloaked behind polite smiles and half-truths. By the time we returned to Baker Street, my mind was a whirl with contradictions. "Holmes," I said, unable to hold back, "if I may confess, I find myself thoroughly adrift." He gestured for me to continue. "Lady Imogen hints at hidden loyalties. Rathbone implies assassination, and Harkort swears to royal discretion. It is as if we are chasing shadows, each darker than the last. But at the core of it, is it not simply a case of blackmail?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, the instinct to locate the simplest explanation is not without virtue. But in this case, blackmail is merely the veil, not the face beneath it. You suspect something larger." "I do," he said. "But let us test your theory. If Lord Marston were blackmailed, the perpetrator must benefit from silence. Yet every movement we trace, every whisper, every attempted threat against us, suggests not a desire to conceal, but to silence entirely." "You mean they wish to erase him?" "Precisely. Marston's disappearance was not the result of shame, but strategy. He knew something, perhaps possessed something, that could fracture the very structure of trust within the monarchy." A silence fell between us. "But Holmes," I said slowly, "if not blackmail, then what?" He stood and moved to the window. "Destabilization, not for profit, nor even ideology, but to realign power. What we are witnessing, Watson, is not the work of a desperate man, but a calculated movement, one that wears the face of patriotism while hollowing the core of the crown." I felt a coldness settle over me. But who would wish for such a thing? Holmes turned. That, my dear fellow, is the final piece, and I fear we are drawing perilously close to its revelation. For the remainder of the evening, Holmes remained uncharacteristically still, seated in his armchair with fingertips pressed together, eyes half closed in deep concentration. I knew from experience that this silence was not inaction, but rather the distillation of chaos into clarity. When at last he stirred, it was with the deliberate certainty of a man who had solved a riddle whispered by ghosts. "It is time," he said, "to see the pattern entire." I leaned forward. "You've discovered the purpose behind Marston's disappearance." "Not merely the purpose, Watson. I have uncovered the architecture of the entire deception." He laid before me a series of documents. Marston's partial note, the pamphlet from St. Albans, Rathbone's articles, and a copy of a speech once delivered by Sir Leontine Harkort in the House of Lords. "Harkort," I said, startled. "Yes, cloaked in loyalty, but laced with warnings of institutional rot and the need for internal reform. Harkort speaks like a guardian of the crown, yet he walks like a man who seeks to reshape it. And the Doves? A loyalist society once, now fractured, its wings clipped and its name borrowed. Harkort did not create them, but he twisted them, a mirror turned just enough to mislead." I stared at the threads he'd drawn together. "So the plot is not to embarrass the monarchy?" Holmes nodded gravely. "It is to replace it, quietly, internally, to seize influence by posing as its protector." A long silence followed. "What shall we do?" I asked at last. "We shall draw them out," he replied, "one by one, and in the end they shall find that the Crown's greatest defence lies not in its armies, but in observation, deduction, and a well-laid trap." And as he leaned back, eyes sharp once more, I knew we were approaching a reckoning not merely of crime, but of conscience. It was on the third day after Holmes had named Sir Leontine Harkort as the likely architect of the conspiracy that he informed me with uncharacteristic gravity that the trap was ready to be set. "The final act, Watson," he said, "must be played upon a stage of their choosing, yet written with our ink." He had spent the better part of the day drafting a series of coded letters, each written in a hand I scarcely recognized, containing veiled references to loyalty, silence, and the new order the Doves had long whispered about. These communications, he explained, were tailored to appeal to each recipient's ambition and fear, inviting them to a clandestine gathering at the ruined chapel of St. Albans, under the pretense of finalizing their plans. "You expect them all to come?" I asked. "Those who must will," Holmes replied. "The promise of power is more irresistible than any snare fashioned of rope." He entrusted the letters to a network of anonymous messengers and instructed Lestrade, who had been briefed in utmost secrecy, to position a team of plainclothes inspectors at strategic vantage points around the chapel. "Tonight, Watson," Holmes said, glancing at the pocket watch that gleamed faintly in the lamplight, "we shall see whether treason wears a crown or a mask." I confess, I felt a tremor of foreboding, though I dared not show it. For if Holmes was correct, then we were about to walk into the very lion's den, armed only with observation, logic, and the perilous trust that those in hiding could still be brought to light. We arrived in St. Albans just past dusk, the sky heavy with cloud and the wind sharp with the scent of cold stone and damp earth. Holmes had already changed his appearance, adopting the persona of a minor barrister sympathetic to the Doves' cause, complete with a slight limp, dyed moustache, and papers forged to perfection. I, however, remained behind, concealed in a nearby outbuilding with Lestrade and his men, armed and silent. The weight of our responsibility pressed heavily upon me, for if Holmes were discovered, we could not reach him swiftly. Holmes slipped inside the ruined chapel alone. From my vantage point, I could see little but the flicker of lantern light moving across the shattered stained glass. Time passed with painful slowness. Inside, as he would later recount to me, Holmes moved among the doves with calculated ease. He was not known to them by face, only by letters and reputation. His voice was measured, his tone reverent, his answers vague enough to inspire curiosity without scrutiny. He allowed others to speak freely, to let names fall from their lips and tempers rise. For the society, though secretive, was fraying beneath the pressure of its own ambition. A man named Lucien Brandt dominated the early discussion, fiery, eloquent, and dangerously confident. He spoke of the memorandum, of the press, of the Queen's implied weakness, and the need to redirect history before history forgets us. Others murmured assent, while a few cast uneasy glances at the chapel's darkened corners. But Holmes noted something more vital than the rhetoric. He observed who deferred to whom, who held the room in moments of silence, and, most crucially, who did not speak at all. And when one figure entered, cloaked and slow of step, the air shifted palpably. It was Lord Marston, alive, and yet strangely calm. Not as a victim, Holmes would tell me later, but as if he had arrived by his own volition, and for a purpose yet untold. The appearance of Lord Marston unsettled the gathering, like a gust of wind through a still chamber. Several men rose to greet him, others whispered to one another behind gloved hands. Holmes, ever the observer, shifted position to better study Marston's expression. He was not afraid, Holmes later told me. There was no look of a man coerced, nor even one clinging to hope. He was resigned, but not broken. And that distinction, Watson, would prove critical. Brandt, who had until then dominated the meeting, appeared momentarily thrown by Marston's arrival. "You come late," he said, forcing a cordial tone. "I come when I choose," Marston replied. "The timing matters only if the truth still does." Holmes noted the veiled challenge in that exchange, the subtle contest of authority. As discussion resumed, the true aim of the gathering emerged. The group intended to release a carefully forged document, styled as a memorandum from the Queen's hand, expressing doubts in the judgment of Parliament and admiration for one particular rising figure in the Lords. It was, in essence, a quiet coup. The doves debated fiercely. Some feared exposure, others called it destiny. Marston remained silent for long minutes, and when he did speak, it was with unexpected weight. "This course," he said, "ends not with reformation, but ruin. You trade monarchy for manipulation, and I will not be complicit." There was a murmur, then silence. And then, from the shadows at the rear of the chapel, a familiar voice cut through the air. "You already are complicit, Lord Marston. The moment you withheld the true memorandum, the real one, you ensured that this meeting would take place." Holmes stepped forward. The spell was broken. A gasp went up. A hand reached for a pistol, but Lestrade's men were already upon them. In the chaos that followed, I caught sight of Holmes through the broken archway, calm, precise, as though he had merely placed the final piece in a chess match too long in play. To say that the appearance of Lord Marston shook the room would be an understatement of criminal proportions. Until that moment, he had existed only in conjecture, a ghost conjured by whispers and theories. Yet here he stood, not bound, not broken, but calm, composed, and utterly enigmatic. The gathering had already been thrown into disarray by Holmes's sudden reveal, but it was Marston's presence that paralysed them. His calm gaze swept the room, taking in the men and women who, moments before, had spoken of reshaping the very foundation of the nation. Holmes moved toward him, and for a moment they stood face to face. I could not read Marston's expression, but I noted that he did not flinch, neither from the recognition nor from the knowledge that the game was lost. "You do not deny your role here," Holmes said evenly. "I cannot," Marston replied, "though I suspect you understand it better than most." Brant, the firebrand speaker from earlier, recovered enough to step forward. "So it was you, Marston, who led them to us, after everything?" Marston turned to him. "Number Y led no one, but I could no longer be part of a lie built upon another." There was a sharp intake of breath among the assembly. Holmes addressed the room. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Marston did not vanish because he was taken. He vanished because he discovered that what he believed to be a cause for justice was instead a mask for a far more insidious ambition." "And what ambition is that?" someone asked defiantly. Holmes gestured toward the shadows. "The answer," he said quietly, "stands among us now." It was a masterstroke of timing, and I saw several faces turn in confusion and fear, glancing nervously about. But Holmes's eyes never left Marston's, and Marston, in turn, did not look at Brant, nor any of the others. He looked toward the rear of the chapel, where Sir Leontine Harkort had just entered. The silence that followed Harcourt's entrance was absolute, so complete that I could hear the faint shifting of boots on stone from the officers behind me. The advisor to the crown, the man who had come to us in secrecy and desperation, now stood among conspirators, unmasked not by evidence, but by context. Holmes took 2 measured steps forward. "Sir Leontine," he said in a voice that carried with calm authority, "you arrived a trifle late for the conclusion of your own performance." Harcourt, ever composed, offered the faintest smile. "Mr. Holmes, I came at your invitation." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I sent none to you." "Didn't you?" Harcourt replied. "Your trail was so exquisitely laid, I couldn't resist following it." "You have always admired symmetry," Holmes said, "even in treason." There was a collective gasp at the word, and Harcourt's gaze sharpened. "You overreach, Mr. Holmes." "Do I? You recruited Lord Marston under the guise of reform, fed him idealism, then planned to use his name and forge documents in his hand to stage a coup, not of force, but of perception." "I sought stability," Harcourt said coldly. "Number you sought power," Holmes replied. "By creating a phantom enemy within the royal court, you intended to erode public trust, shift support to your allies in the Lords, and place yourself as the architect of a new order, all while appearing its reluctant saviour." A murmur ran through the doves. Some stepped back from Harcourt instinctively. Marston, for his part, stood rigid. "I believed you," he said, voice trembling. "You told me the Queen herself feared Parliament's corruption, that the memorandum was genuine." Harcourt's composure cracked ever so slightly. "It was not the Queen's hand," Holmes said, holding up the recovered seal fragment, "but yours. The broken quill, the stolen wax. Clever, but not perfect." Brant moved as if to speak, but Holmes cut him short. "Mr. Brant, your fiery oratory was useful to Harcourt, but he never intended for you to rise. Your name was not on the forged documents, only his." The room dissolved into chaos, accusations, confusion, denial. Lestrade stepped forward at last, producing a warrant. "In the name of Her Majesty," he declared, "Sir Leontine Harkort You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and sedition. Harkort said nothing. Only met Holmes's gaze with a cold, knowing smile, as if to say that the game was not over, merely paused. Holmes returned the look without blinking. Checkmate, he said softly. In the seconds that followed Lestrade's declaration, the chamber seemed to fracture from within. The unity that had once held the doves together dissolved as swiftly as frost under flame. Members began to turn on one another, each eager to distance themselves from the treason that now clung like smoke to the rafters above them. It was Harkort who supplied the forged seal, one man cried, pointing a shaking finger. He told us the Queen had authorized the memorandum, another added. I was deceived, muttered Brant, his fire extinguished in a single breath. Holmes moved slowly through the disorder, saying nothing, his expression unreadable. He stopped only when he stood beside Lord Marston, whose face was pale, though composed. I moved to his side, compelled by a sense of moral necessity. You were to be their figurehead, Holmes said at last, not accusingly, but with a curious tone of lament. Marston nodded. The plan was simple. I would emerge with the Queen's supposed endorsement, bearing the forged memorandum, and call for a reformation of the Lords. A transition, they said. Not a coup. Not bloodless, perhaps, but orderly. And the populace? I asked. They were never part of the consideration, he replied, bitterness creeping into his voice. I was to be the bridge between monarchy and reform, a bridge meant to collapse the moment it was crossed. Holmes nodded once, slowly. And so Harcourt built a crown not to wear, but to place on another's head. Yours. It was never my ambition, Marston said quietly. I thought, God help me, I thought it was service. Holmes turned to the gathered crowd, many now restrained by Lestrade's men. This, he said, raising his voice just enough to command attention, is what comes when honour is perverted by ideology, when loyalty becomes theatre, when those closest to power believe themselves above the consequences of its corruption. There was no applause, no outcry, only the creak of timbers and the sigh of shame from men who had convinced themselves of righteousness, only to be stripped of its illusion. As the prisoners were escorted out and the chapel fell again into uneasy silence, Holmes turned to me. It is curious, Watson, he said thoughtfully, how the gravest threats to the realm so often arrive with letters of introduction and polished boots, not in the shadows, but in plain sight, behind smiling masks. And now? I asked. He looked up once more at the stone arch above us. Now, he said, we return to Baker Street, for the truth, it seems, has done its duty for one night. It was 2 days after the collapse of the Doves when Holmes, at last, consented to speak of the affair in full. We had returned to Baker Street in the small hours of the morning following the arrests, and he had since remained in one of his peculiar moods, neither withdrawn nor restless, but absorbed in a manner I had come to recognize as the final polishing of a theory already proved. He waited until I had taken my place opposite him by the fire before he stirred, steepling his fingers and turning his sharp gaze upon me. You will recall, Watson, he began, that our first indication of deception lay not in what was present, but in what was missing. The study? I offered. Precisely. The cipher burned, the wax smudged, the envelope crumpled, yet nothing that revealed its intent directly remained. That, in itself, was a declaration. He rose and paced slowly. The entire plot rested upon perception. The forged letter was intended not to communicate a truth, but to create the illusion of royal endorsement. Its phrasing was carefully chosen, ambiguous, deferential, easily misconstrued if leaked, yet worded with enough gravitas to sway Parliament. Had it surfaced at the right moment, it might well have tipped the balance in Harcourt's favour. I nodded. And Lord Marston? He was the ideal pawn, noble birth, moderate views, and just enough disillusionment with the current order to be tempted by the promise of reform. Harcourt needed only to isolate him, suggest the Crown's silent approval, and allow idealism to do the rest. But when Marston discovered the deception, he vanished, not in fear, but in protest. That is why he left the clues half destroyed. It was a quiet plea for someone to follow the thread and unearth the rot behind the pageantry. Holmes paused. Had we arrived even a day later, Watson, I fear the forged memorandum would already have been delivered, and the Queen's reputation compromised beyond repair. He looked into the fire then, his face unreadable. In such games, the damage is often done not by the blow, but by the suggestion that the blade was ever drawn. Holmes moved to his desk, retrieving a small wooden box. From it he removed the broken quill and a hardened fragment of red wax, the two innocuous objects which, he claimed, had tied the entire conspiracy together. It is remarkable, Watson, how treason often rests on the subtlest of implements, he remarked, turning the items over in his hand. This quill belonged not to Lord Marston, but to a certain private clerk within the royal household, whose penmanship Harcourt had studied for over a year. I stared at him, astonished. You mean to say Harcourt imitated the clerk's hand? Perfectly. His own correspondence was plain and rigid, utterly unsuited to the soft curvature of courtly script. It was the broken tip that betrayed him. He had not the training to maintain a flourish under pressure. One can forge many things, Watson, but muscle memory is not among them. And the wax? A rarer proof still. This, he said, tapping the hardened fragment, is composed of a blend unique to Buckingham Palace. A precise ratio of beeswax and pigment used only for internal memoranda. It is not available commercially and would only be present in the private offices of the Crown. I was silent, impressed once more by his eye for detail. Holmes continued. The presence of such a seal on a letter, never recorded by the palace's own ledger, was damning. It proved that someone had access, not simply to the palace, but to the materials of trust. And only Harcourt? Only one who sat close enough to the throne to be believed, yet far enough to covet its influence. Harcourt's access to the seal, his ideological speeches, his manipulation of the doves, all served the singular goal of orchestrating a controlled transition, one that would leave him shaping the monarchy from behind a curtain of patriotism. He placed the quill and wax back into the box and shut it gently. Tools, Watson, he said. Not merely for writing, but for rewriting history had he succeeded. And in that moment, I understood. This had never been merely a mystery. It was a safeguard against forgetting that power, misused in silence, can be far more dangerous than any cry raised in rebellion. Holmes had resumed his seat, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze now fixed not upon the fire, but inward, into the vast storehouse of deduction which his singular mind so meticulously maintained. You asked me once, Watson, he said at length, whether the doves were real or a fiction conjured to disguise some darker purpose. I nodded. And you replied that they were both. Indeed, he continued, the doves of St. Albans began, as so many societies do, with idealism, a collection of noblemen, scholars, and minor clergy who believed in quiet reform within the system, seeking to temper the weight of tradition with the breath of modern reason. Their motto was borrowed from Tacitus, silentium regit mundum, silence governs the world. a curious irony in retrospect. They met in secret, I asked. In discretion, not in concealment. Their names were known to one another, their ambitions debated without malice. But in time, as with all organizations, a schism formed between those who sought change through reasoned discourse and those who hungered for structural upheaval. Harkort, ever the strategist, saw his opportunity. He courted both sides, playing the moderate while feeding the radicals just enough rhetoric to stoke their cause. And Marston? He believed himself among friends, Holmes said. He imagined the Doves to be a place where conscience could guide policy. What he failed to see was that Harkort had already turned the flock. The society had become a mirror, reflecting back to each man the vision he wished to see, until no one could say for certain who led and who followed. I leaned back, considering. But why such subtlety? Why not simply declare their intention? Because, Holmes said quietly, subtlety is the weapon of those who know they are not yet strong enough to act openly. Harcourt's brilliance lay not in the forging of false documents, but in the crafting of narrative. He understood that in a nation governed by perception as much as law, it is not action which topples thrones, but belief. I was silent, struck by the scale of it. Holmes turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. The Doves were not myth, Watson. They were merely misguided, and in the hands of a man like Harkort that was enough. He needed no army, only faithful men with blurred convictions and clean reputations. I exhaled slowly. A flock turned to wolves. Holmes nodded. And the shepherd wore the crown's colours. In the days that followed the unmasking at the chapel ruins, I found myself more disturbed than I cared to admit. There had been bloodier cases, more vicious crimes, and certainly more dangerous adversaries, but none had unsettled me quite as this one had. For what we had uncovered was not merely treason, nor even manipulation of a high order. It was betrayal, calculated, intellectual, and cold, executed not by zealots or fanatics, but by men in polished boots and refined collars, the very sort whom society teaches us to trust. I confess it rattled my view of the world. I had long taken comfort in the idea that honour and position were companions, that men who sat at the Queen's table did so because they had earned that place through loyalty and service. But Harkort had reminded me that ambition wears all manner of masks, and that treachery often whispers with the softest voice. Lord Marston's face lingered in my thoughts. His idealism had nearly made him the architect of disaster, and yet I could not bring myself to condemn him. He had believed in something noble, even if he had been blind to its distortion. In that, he seemed more a casualty than a culprit. Holmes, of course, was untroubled by such sentiment. He viewed the affair as an equation solved, a pattern revealed and corrected. And yet, I sensed something in his silence after the case, a weight perhaps not of emotion, but of recognition. Even he could not deny that the threat had lain so close to the seat of power that it might well have succeeded without ever firing a shot. I thought of the Queen herself, never named, never seen, but ever present, and wondered if she too had sensed the breath of danger pass so near her crown. It was a sobering realization, and one that, for all its resolution, left a shadow across my heart. For some betrayals, though halted, still leave a bruise upon the soul. It was 2 evenings after Holmes had rendered his full account that the knock came, soft, deliberate, and utterly unremarkable. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, brought word that a lady had arrived, cloaked in mourning, and requesting a private audience with Mr. Holmes. I made to excuse myself, but Holmes stopped me with a glance. "No, Watson, I should like you to remain." When she entered, I saw at once that this was no ordinary visitor. Though her bearing was humble, there was a composure to her posture, a quiet authority that needed no declaration. The veil she wore obscured much of her countenance, but it did little to hide the weight of dignity she carried with her. Her voice, when it came, was low and firm, devoid of ceremony, yet steeped in something far older than privilege. "I have not come officially," she said. "There shall be no record of this visit. I am merely grateful." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth is its own reward, madam." She seemed to consider that, then stepped forward and placed a small envelope on the mantel. "Then let this be only a token of appreciation, from a family that understands the cost of silence." He made no move to touch it. She turned to go, but paused at the door. "My father once said," she murmured, "that the weight of the crown is not in its gold, but in what it must carry unseen." And then she was gone. Neither Holmes nor I spoke for several minutes after. The fire crackled softly. At last he reached for the envelope, opened it, and removed a single sheet of parchment. No seal, no signature, only 6 words in a graceful, unmistakable hand. "Your silence has preserved our peace." He folded the note carefully and placed it into the drawer with the broken quill. We sat long that night in a silence of another kind, one not born of mystery, but of conclusion. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, and the faintest light of moon showed itself through the high panes of our sitting-room window. It was Holmes who spoke first, not with his usual incisiveness, but in a tone laced with something heavier, more reflective. "Tell me, Watson," he said quietly, "do you ever consider how many secrets the world holds, not buried in darkened rooms or whispered in alleys, but seated quietly at the highest tables?" "I suppose," I said, "that I prefer not to." Holmes offered a faint smile, a sentiment shared by most, and perhaps wisely so. He paused, his gaze falling to the drawer where the note now rested. "This case has reminded me of something I too often forget, that power and secrecy are not distant cousins but intimate companions. We are taught to believe that truth rises, that it ascends as smoke from fire. But truth, Watson, can be buried not by earth, but by deference, by loyalty, tradition, and the gentle nods of men who believe silence to be a virtue." I studied him. "You speak of Harkort?" Number Harkort was no mystery. He was a man whose ambition outpaced his conscience. But he succeeded, almost, because those around him refused to question, because it is far easier to call treachery a misunderstanding than to name it plainly. He wrapped his scheme in the colours of the crown and nearly prevailed through the civility of others. I was silent, for I could find no fault in the assessment. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window, his figure framed against the soft grey light. "They shall say nothing, of course. The matter will vanish from Parliament's lips like breath on glass. Marston will retire abroad. The doves will dissipate like scattered leaves. And Harkort will never be named in any official record." "Then all of this," I began. "Was necessary," Holmes interrupted. "Because sometimes, Watson, the preservation of a nation rests not upon punishment, but prevention. We did not drag the truth into the light. We merely ensured it would not become a weapon in the dark." He turned back to me, and in his eyes I saw no pride, only weariness. "Even the grandest crowns," he said softly, "rest upon heads burdened by secrets, my dear Watson. But it is our burden too, to bear them without letting them break us." And with that, he returned to his seat, lit a fresh match, and reached for his violin. The case of the royal conspiracy was closed, but the silence, as ever, remained. As the lamplight flickered low and the streets of London faded once more into fog, I found myself watching Holmes with a renewed sense of awe and perhaps melancholy. The violin lay silent by the hearth. He had not played since the note arrived. "Holmes," I ventured, "do you suppose that had Lord Marston never uncovered the forgery, the entire affair might have succeeded?" He leaned back, his gaze distant. "Success, Watson," he murmured, "is often nothing more than a well-timed lie. But the greater tragedy is not in the lie itself. It is in how many are willing to believe it, for the sake of comfort, tradition, or ambition." He turned to me then, eyes sharp beneath the calm. "It is not always the crime that threatens a nation, but the silence that follows it. The most dangerous deceptions, my dear fellow, are not shouted from rooftops. They are whispered in corridors lined with velvet." Holmes paused, as if considering something further. "Tell me, Watson, what would you say was Harkort's greatest miscalculation?" I pondered the question in silence. But now, dear reader, Holmes poses the same question to you. What do you believe was the criminal's biggest mistake in the case of the royal silence? Was it underestimating Holmes's eye for detail, trusting Marston too far, or believing that secrets in high places would remain buried? We'd love to hear your theories. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what clue you found most intriguing. If this mystery stirred your imagination, subscribe for more cases from the world of Sherlock Holmes, and share this story with fellow lovers of deduction, suspense, and classic intrigue, because the game, dear friends, is always afoot.